Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Reading Africa panel, which is um, linguistic landscapes, Francophone literature in Africa. And I'm joined today by Raphaël Thierry. I probably mispronounced that,
It's
so
okay.
sorry.
It's perfect.
And Khalid Lyam. I'm going to butcher your name. Sorry.
That's okay.
How do you pronounce your last name,
L
Khalid?
Lyamlahy?
Lyamlahy.
Yeah, that's
Um,
perfect actually. Thank you.
well, well, it's easy to repeat. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We do have a one of the participants is unable to join due to a family emergency, and another participant we're hoping might have some connection problems and will be able to join us. But Raphael and Khalid will be having this conversation until our third participant is able to join us. But welcome, and we're so pleased to have the first conversation about Francophone literature for Reading Africa Week. So I'm super excited about that. Um, this is the eighth annual Reading Africa Week, and it's been our most exciting yet. So thank you for everyone who's participated. If you write anything in social media during this, if you quote anything, please include the hashtag Reading Africa so we can find it and like it and share it. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Raphael, who can also introduce Khalid, and we'll get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Tyler, and all the team that is really doing so great around Reading Africa and all the Catalyst Press as well, Adventure. I'm very grateful that we are actually many to be interested by such an important topic. And I'm very much interested, Jessica, when you say that this is the first Francophone panel, and this speaks volume. It's so important to bridge and to develop this, and maybe work on, overpassing these historical bridges that are sometimes a bit remaining. And in this sense, I'm so happy that Khalid was also a friend and somehow a colleague as well. That you can be with us, Khalid, and especially in a very special time because you're also in your very holiday, so you're taking this time for us, and we will try to make the best to highlight many aspects of your work. So just to set the tone of what I was expecting in this conversation, it has to be something kind of a back and forth, in my opinion, a very lively discussion. So Khalid, feel free to digress, to circle back if you want to react on something that was said before. I think the best discussion has to be moving on, and then we can also enlarge to some maybe a discussion with the audience. Just have something which is simple and lively. That's the idea.
Sure.
But so thank you again, and Khalid, maybe to introduce you. I think you have so many hats. That's something quite amazing with you. I could define you as a Moroccan and French writer, literary critic, academic. You're a poet, you're a translator. You have many things on your table, actually. You're currently an assistant professor at the Chicago University, and you're specializing in Francophone literature and postcolonial literature, especially. You also have an engineering background, which is interesting. Maybe it's also part of this multifaceted personality of yours, which is so fascinating. And but more importantly, about what concerns us, you have a PhD in Francophone literature, which means that you're focusing a lot on contemporary fiction, poetry, postcolonial theory. You have published many articles on such topics, and especially a very important work recently published, Nostalgic Rebels, that you have co-authored around the Souffles journal and about Khaireddin, Katibi, Laâbi, such important milestones of Moroccan uh, post-colonial, maybe literature, so to say. You also, and I know you very, very well on this aspect, a novelist. You have published two novels at Présence Africaine Edition. One is a foreign novel, un roman étranger, the first one, and the second one, Memorial in Venice. And I will put the title in English because the English edition is up to be published, and the announcement was actually made today, which is kind of amazing. And we will come back to that for sure. But you're also a poet. You have published and co-authored the work J'ai rencontré un cheval de mer. I met a seahorse with Rim Rennes. Ren?
Khan, yes.
Ren. And you have translated Felwine Sarr into Arabic. We will come back on that as well. But to summarize, maybe your work maybe gather literary criticism, postcolonial theory, poetic writing around exile, memory, and probably identity as well. Am I summarizing it well, dear Khalid?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Thank you for covering like as you rightly said, like all these different fields and forms of writing that I practice.
Mm.
And thank you, Rafael, for bringing me in and for including me and facilitating my participation in this panel. And thank you to Jessica Powers. Thank you to Catalyst Press. My understanding is that this has been like a recurring event, and I'm really really glad to delighted to participate in this panel, in this conversation. Thank you.
Yes, but what I could say that we could have, in another context, have had this conversation in French, and that's the magic of Catalyst and Reading Africa Week, that we will try to bridge some topic that could be we could be discussing often, and navigate in this conversation around history, borders, frontiers, translation, aesthetics, maybe intertextuality. There are some things to say about that. Activism, maybe, and of course, publishing, but primarily you, Khalid.
Thank you.
So maybe I was thinking about a first point to start the very conversation, thinking about this Francophone African literature or Francophone literature, which is not that simple, basically. It's easy to say Francophone literature, but in the end, the history shows us that there were some separation at some point, and there were movements and there were moments as well. In terms of moments, maybe bridging African literature and Francophone literature on a global scale. I could think about this Kampala Conference of African Writers in 1962. But I could also think about this Présence Africaine Congress of 1956, a Congress of Black artists and writers that was considered as a cultural Bandung. So we could think that these milestones are somehow have paved a way that is now solid. But somehow we keep having debates and strong discussion around that Francophone literature. I think in the around the late 2000 years, there was a discussion about this column towards the world literature in French. And this will be my first maybe question about you, for you, sorry, Khalid, thinking about this. Sometimes Francophone literature could be also isolated from the literature from France or published in France. And that's a strong debate which brings archipelagos, which brings thinking on rhythm, maybe glissant could also be part of that. But how would you engage on that notion of Francophone literature with this background?
Well, thank you very much. Well, that is a very interesting and perhaps a complex question that
It is.
that perhaps right we need to kind of break down into several other questions and discussions. But let me say that what I usually tell my students is that the notion of Francophone literature or in plural actually Francophone literatures, because there are many literatures that are written in French. I mean, uh, is closely related to the history of the presence of French language across the world, right? And that history is pretty much a colonial, influenced also by colonial presence and colonial legacies, right? So writers across the world, including in the African continent, who actually write in French, they do so because they have, inherited the French language from the colonial period, from the French schools that they have attended. And what they did with the French language is that they appropriated that language and they reinvented it, right? They have made French into a different language, a multi-layered language, a language that could embrace, national contexts and, a language that is also mindful of other languages, right? So for instance, I mean, if I want to focus perhaps on the North African context a little bit, what was very interesting in the years following independence is that these writers who write in French, what they sought to do is to basically, do violence to the language as well, right? So you have all these kind of innovative techniques and innovative usage of French. So pushing French to the boundaries, distorting the language, using, like reinventing, even like inventing new words, working with neologisms, for instance. And in terms of like the poetic, also the poetic force of the language, right? So, for instance, in poetry, someone like Muhammad Khairuddin, for instance, would kind of, create his own words, right? That are both inspired by his southern Amazigh land and actually, the readings of French poetry that have influenced his writing. So, so that there is something both, I guess, creative and subversive, right, about the use of French as a language in African literature. So that's number one. And the number two, going, focusing on on the part of your question, Raphael, when you talk about the distinction between, Francophone literature and French literature. So what I like to say to my students, what I like to repeat often in my classes is that Francophone literature should be any literature written in French, right?
Mm.
So, so it's a good reminder that even French literature, in the sense of like literatures by French writers writing in French, that is Francophone literature too, right? So I know it's not what it doesn't reflect necessarily what happens, when you go to a bookstore, for instance, in Paris, and you see that separation being made, right, between French writers and Francophone writers. What is interesting as well is that you see also writers who are labeled as Francophone, right? Like let's say at the beginning of their career, they are just Francophone writers. But once they gain some sort of like popularity, once they start winning literary prizes, and there is something about the reception of their works that shifts a little bit, and they make it to the French, writing category, right? So all this is to say that there are obviously, like a persistence, I would say, sense of hierarchy in terms of French language literatures between basically literature that is French and literature that is written in French by writers outside of France, right? And we see that even like, from with writers actually, coming from overseas French territories, for instance, right? They are French, they write in French, but often they are categorized as Francophone writers. And we don't
Mm.
use the term Francophone to describe or designate a French writer, for instance. So I think, I guess, one has to be aware of all these kind of, questions and issues that come with the with labels such as francophone. But at the end of the day, when you open a book, when you start reading a novel, you're just reading an African novel. The fact that it is written in French or in English or in other languages, I think it just, it is just one element and one aspect of your reading experience, of your experience as a reader, as a scholar, as a literary critique, etc., etc. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's so important what you say, and I remembered, by the way, Kateb Yacine saying that French was basically a tribute of war.
The
Uh,
spoils, yeah, spoils of the war. Exactly.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just to maybe complete, Jessica, you asked about does such phenomenon could be observed in other uh, English or Portuguese speaking country? I think this has to be a very this is a conversation that could just come back somehow to this history around political, economic, symbolic, aesthetics construction. And language is also a construction which was made at some point, decided to be also more influenced by such a center, because that center was maybe the colonial center. But at some point, there was a shift as well, and things have evolved, but the center remained economically there as well. So somehow this is something which also exists in other countries, but in a different direction. And speaking about other way of writing, of course, every single cultural place has its way of putting literature, but it's not about a place, it's all about writers, it's about aesthetics, it's about choices. And that's what makes such topics so large, and also sometimes the notion of francophone so ambiguous on some aspects as well, because as you say very clearly, uh, a writer wouldn't define himself as I'm a francophone. We are all francophone somehow. And what is a francophone? It could be very wide reflection. But then we comes to the center. Where does literature gain the most attention? And when this comes through some literary prizes, some big publishing houses, we could understand that maybe this writer was more highlighted with this scheme, with this specific, I would say, etiquette, which was helping his access to bookshelves and bookstores and libraries, etc. But this remains ambiguous because there are some so strong voices. We were mentioning Souffles, the journal which was created in the independencies, and that really transformed the literary landscape. I could mention the Présence Africaine journal as well. And this is when I think we need writers like you who are also researchers to explore new writing this history. And maybe this is a way for me to jump on your first novel, Un roman étranger, which somehow addresses such a theme. Could you maybe give us some words about Un roman étranger, which was published, if I'm correct, in 2017, and about a free side quest, maybe in a city that could be Paris, and linked to some aspect of this etiquette that we're dealing with?
Yes, sure. Just before that, Raphael, because I saw there was a question and comment about colonialism and how colonialism was different, and depending on whether it was on in areas controlled by the French, the British, or the Portuguese, and also the consequences, right, of colonialism on literatures, on post-colonial literatures. Of course, there were like huge differences, or at least like different contexts have produced different literatures, right? But I would say one common feature between, across the post-colonial world in terms of writing and in terms of literary experience is what I was describing earlier. I think is the coexistence of Francophone literatures with other and different forms of multilingualism, right? So since I think one of the questions earlier was, for instance, about, and I saw like the Portuguese context,
Mm,
right? So that made me think, I'm not a specialist, but I read a couple of years ago a French translation of a novel by Angolan award-winning author Onjaki, right? And Onjaki's writing is very interesting because he incorporates like the spoken language of Luanda in Angola in his novels, and I read it in French translation, right? Which is also very interesting because I saw the translator, or I felt that the translator was trying to reproduce that multilingual aspect and that kind of encounter between languages in French. So the translator had to introduce, for instance, some footnotes, to explain like some local terms, local idioms. So that is very interesting because it kind of reinforces through translation, and perhaps we will go back to the question of translation, Raphael, which is also like at the core of this conversation, right? But just this is just like one example, and I think so. What I would say about um, in the, let's say, in the North African context, the earlier works that were published in the 1960s, right? So right after independence, they had in common, a certain form of like subversiveness and
mm,
innovative use of language, and you would find that at different levels and made through the experience of different authors, right? So if you take, for instance, one of the earliest works, since someone is, I think Laura Parker is asking us about just some titles, there is perhaps one novel to start with in the North African context, which was published interestingly 2 years before the independence of Morocco in 1954. Morocco got independence in 1956, which is The Simple Past by Driss Schreiber.
mm,
So, and this novel, by the way, has been republished recently in the New York Review of Books Classics series, which was some sort of like, recognition or kind of international recognition of the value of that work. So that work was extremely subversive in terms of like challenging both the colonial structures, because it was written during the last couple of years of colonialism, French colonialism, and at the same time kind of targeting and trying to undermine the local patriarchal
mm,
structures of Moroccan society, focusing on the figure of the father in the novel, right? So The Simple Past by Driss Schreiber is a great work to get a sense of like the early, I would say, signs of what was happening around that time. Um, Obviously, I think the other major work that one has to read to get a sense of that innovative aspect that I'm talking about, although it's a bit complex, is Nejma by Kateb Yacine, by the Algerian writer Kateb Yacine. I think it has been translated into English. It's available in English translation. And this is a very also interesting work because it speaks to it brings together like the national context in Algeria, but also the kind of poetic what the poetics of writing fiction can actually do to literature. So it's very structurally complex, and it uses different characters, bringing them together in some sort of like polyphonic reflection about post-colonial identity in Algeria, in the Algerian context.
mm.
So there are other. I think I can write later more examples about this literature if other people are interested in that. But I think you've asked me, Raphaël, about my first novel, right?
Yeah.
Un roman étranger, which I usually translate as a foreign novel, right? I think, it's interesting that you're starting with that novel because I called it precisely un roman étranger, a foreign novel, because I wanted to allude to the categories that you were describing earlier, right? So the fact that, in the French context, we usually use un roman étranger for anything that is any kind of literary work that has been written in a language other than French, right?
Mm.
And then translated back into French, right? So, and you see that also at the level of like when you think about literary prizes, right? So you often have some literary prizes that are dedicated to romans étrangers, so
Yeah.
to foreign authors on foreign works. So I guess I was playing a little bit with the category of the foreign, right? And the idea behind that novel was very simple, is that it was based on my obviously my personal experience. So I was living in France, I was working as an engineer, and I had to renew every year my residence card, right? Residency card, and I had to go through like this whole thing about like how do you renew an official document that proves your identity abroad, right? And I realized that people around me were actually not aware of what a residency card is, right? So I guess I wanted to turn that topic and to turn like the anxiety that surrounds the process into writing. And I came up with the idea of this kind of student who is trying to renew his documents, right? And at the same time, he's trying to write his first novel. So it was a way to bring into dialogue, I guess, the writing of the process of writing, and the process of or the struggle to make yourself visible abroad as a foreigner, as a foreign student, as someone who is considered as a foreign, right?
Mm.
So, and it was very productive, like to reflect on those two items, at the same time. And what I tried to do actually on a more kind of linguistic and structural level is that I really built the novel by combining those layers, right? So moving from like discussing what is writing, what is the writing in the making, right? And what is an ID card? What is a residency card? What is it? What does it mean to be a foreigner
Yeah.
abroad, right? So a foreigner who's trying both to write, his novel and to find a place and to be acknowledged in a place where he doesn't belong, basically. Yeah. So that was the idea behind that.
Thank you so much, Khalid. This novel is very interesting, and I will come back maybe around the spatiality in that novel. That is also a big part of your work and your aesthetics. But I will just keep this for maybe later. I just want to jump on a question around Mongo Beti.
Mhm.
I'm not, to be very absolutely honest, I'm not a very specialist of Mongo Beti, but about his way of shifting of genres at the end of his literary career, at least as a novelist, and maybe to embrace something which was more related to crime fiction, polar in French, which wasn't fully crime fiction, basically, but I think about Trop de soleil tue l'amour, that was never translated in English, which might somehow be linked to crime fiction. But I think you also need, maybe as an understanding of writers from this very strong African literature classic background, because Mongo Beti or Amadou Kourouma or Sonila Boutansi are part of that very corpus. They also, through, first they were, I would say, put in some category in terms of literature. And then across their career, I would say, that's my understanding, that they step by step not escape, but try to propose something else in terms of aesthetics. And this was also some shift that we can observe in the late 90s, that this so-called Francophone literature took many different directions in terms of genres, in terms of experience, literary experiences. And somehow this literary canon that was forged by classics, sometimes also influenced by publishers that were very much Parisian publishers, took a little bit of distance as an influence on what writers were doing. And if I mention Mongo Beti, it's also interesting because he was actually publishing his own work in his last year of life. He was also his own publisher. And maybe he also came back to Cameroon. So there was also this movement of coming back and maybe trying something else, far away from this very, very strong influence that could be French publishing. And when I say French, it's from France. But that's my appreciation. It doesn't have to be the very answer to such interesting and fascinating question. Maybe you could have yourself an opinion on that, Khalid, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, and I think there are so many examples because I think the question was about shifts that happen,
Yes.
usually happen in the career of across the career of African authors. I'm thinking of several other examples. So since we've already talked about Algerian writer Kateb Yacine, who's been like a central figure in in Francophone North African literature, Katib Yassin has a very interesting experience in the sense that he decided, after having published his early works in French, right? He decided to shift his focus both in form and in language. In the 1970s, he started writing plays, or like he started earlier than that, but he focused on the writing of plays, so theater, and he wrote those plays in Algerian dialects rather than in French. And there was this very interesting shift from actually French to Algerian dialects and from the novel to theater, with the idea of reconnecting or perhaps reaching more easily Algerian people. So there is always that, going back to the same question about like, accessibility. How do you make yourself as a writer heard and understood by the people you are supposed to serve or you are supposed to belong to, right? So I would say that Katib Yassin was probably a very kind of interesting shift, both in terms of literary genre, right, and also in terms of language. I'm also thinking about there are two other examples that come to mind. So the first one is another Algerian writer, Rachid Boujedra, who was also a very famous and prominent figure in the 1960s, 1970s. He published his novels in France, and at some point he decided to start writing in Arabic. So he hasn't abandoned French, but he tried to write and publish some novels and some literary works in Arabic, right? Which is also a very interesting move. He was also involved in the translation of some of back into French, from Arabic into French. But he also went back later and wrote novels in French. And there are also, I mean, to kind of expand the scope a little bit, I'm thinking also about, someone like Senegalese writer Boubacar Boris Diop, right?
Yes, absolutely. Dumigolo.
So, yeah. So
Yes.
Boubacar Boris Diop's, kind of decision to write, to stop, I mean, stop writing in French and start writing in Wolof, right?
Mm.
What is interesting, I find here, I mean, and I think the influence of Ngugi wa Thiong'o was kind of central, to this conversation around languages and multilingualism and the writing, language as a writing tool, right? And also
Mm.
with always the idea of the audience in mind, right?
Mm.
So what is interesting is that I learned recently that actually also like now we see Boubacar Boris Diop's books being published again in French. And apparently he is again involved in the process of either translating, but I would say I think it's more about rewriting the novels in French, right?
Yeah.
So there is this sort of like back and forth and almost like very interesting dynamics in terms of like what are the languages that are used to
Mm.
write and for what purpose, right? I think this has to do with what you were saying earlier, Raphael, about about the Parisian context, right? And Paris being, you know, uh, still or to some degree or to some extent the center or of where center of like francophone, one of the centers at least now nowadays where francophone literature is read and received. And so I guess, rewriting one's novels in French and republishing them in Paris is also a way of like, regaining, I guess, some positionality within that field, right? So, but this tension between like the audience and the writer is like an ongoing debate,
Mm.
right? And it's an ongoing conversation. And this is where translation helps a lot, I think. I personally see that translation has a very crucial role when it comes to disseminating African literatures. So, for instance, I mean, I moved to the US in 2019, and I noticed, like, in the past years, I noticed like there is an increasing interest in translating North African authors, for instance, into English, from French into English.
Yeah.
And I can see that because I use those translations in my classes, and I'm very fortunate that those translations exist. But what is interesting is that when these authors are translated into English, they are recontextualized, right? They are reread, reinterpreted, and I think the translation breathes like new life into these works and repurposes them for the English speaking readers. So it kind of almost like a revival of this African literature, Francophone African literature, through translation. And I think it's fascinating because it makes that literature available again, to
Mm.
different audiences. And I think there is something that needs to be said about that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think it's an opportunity to jump into the translation and also the US perspective. There is a lot of discussion and work around retranslating works. As you mentioned, translation is also a contextualization. And I could just think about someone we both know very well, Ross Schwartz, who
Mhm.
was actually the translator of a fundamental text of Sembène Ousmane, Senegalese major social novelist and writer. And his very first novel, Le Docker Noir, Black Docker, was actually published in the African Writer Series, translated in the African Writer Series in the late 80s. And Ross Schwartz was one of Ross' early works. And as the African Writer Series are currently reissued, notably at Bloomsbury, Ross is engaged on having a revised translation of her own work, and she was glad to do that. And that's also quite interesting to think that a translation is never set in stone. There is not a very, very definitive translation, and things has to be also re-explored. And it's part of also all of these movements that happen in the US. I think about the Own Voices movement that was very strong on social media and influenced a lot of translation and works since 2015, if I'm correct.
Mhm.
And coming back to translation, I really think like having very classic texts like Sembène Ousmane or Aimé Césaire to have new translation is very essential to also re-understand a literature from a certain area and also to escape somehow this very historical burden that could be language somehow. I don't know what you think about this.
Yes, sure. No, 100%. I think, by the way, the African writers, African publishing, is that African publishing series, right?
Yes.
Driss Shreibi has one novel, Moroccan writer Driss Shreibi was also translated in that same series. So it's very interesting because I think that series, what that series was doing more particularly is also like, having this kind of more inclusive and interconnected area for African literature. So it's very interesting because it kind of resonates with what some African publishers are trying to do right now, right? In terms of like appropriating African literature, publishing African literature in Africa as well, and trying to, disseminate the works across the continents. And I think this is something that needs to be also acknowledged and encouraged, right? So there are other. I know, Rafael, this is something that really, that holds like importance to you. Is kind of also like supporting networks of in terms of publishing and circulation of literary works in the African continent itself, right?
Mm.
But I agree with what you said about translation being, a process, an ongoing process that is based also on like revising, going back to read and reassess the works. And also I think what is interesting, I mean, but that said, I want to add something to that perhaps, is that we also have to say and acknowledge that translation remains also caught, I guess, in a power dynamics, right? Because it's very interesting to see as well, like what gets translated and what doesn't get translated. So translation often also comes as a as the culmination of a process, right? So I know so many like great works that haven't made it to translation, that haven't been translated, or that are being considered now, like 50 years after their publication, they are only being considered today as potentially, works to be translated. So, so it's also, I think when we talk about translation, we talk about, moving from one language to the other, but also like we are also talking about the challenges, and the inequalities, right? Social, economic inequalities that pretty much define, translation as a process and as also like you know as a as a literary phenomena, right? And the other thing I want to say here, and I think it's an opportunity to say it as well, is that unfortunately, and this is like a global, I think, global phenomenon, I think translators are not sufficiently acknowledged,
Yeah.
across the world, including when we talk about African literatures. Often, translators' names are often not mentioned on the book cover. It goes like it starts with some little signs like this one, right? uh, or for instance, when we talk about a translated work, we completely overlook the name and the experience of the translator. For me, translation is as much a rewriting, right, as it is a transposition of a literary work from one language to the other. It's not just about like taking one work written in French and making it, available in English. It's about actually rewriting, that work and making it, accessible and also receivable by a new audience. And you can't do that if you don't have that experience. If you don't have that relationship, that close relationship with languages. you know um, and I think at the core of every translation there is this idea of connecting spaces, connecting
Yeah.
cultural spaces, connecting histories, connecting literary experiences, right? I can give you one example of that, and this is like a personal example. I wouldn't call myself a translator, but as many scholars, I practice translation on a regular basis, right? Because when you write an academic book or when you write an article, sometimes you are asked to include English translations of quotations, from writers. So you have to translate, right? So a few years ago, I decided to translate that very short essay by Senegalese
Yes.
writer and thinker Felwine Sarr, yeah, right, who's now a colleague at Duke. He teaches currently at Duke, and why I picked that book? It's a very short book. It's like 50 pages, and it deals with the question of how we inhabit the world, right? So it's like this kind of philosophical reflection about our relationship with the environments, with what surrounds us in terms of living organisms and living beings, right?
Mm.
Well, one reason why I translated that book, because I precisely found that it has so much resonance in the North African context, and some of his ideas about like thinking Africa differently. I encourage, perhaps the audience, if they are interested, he has this, I mean, his most famous book is Afrotopia, which was published
Yeah.
by, I think in English translation by University of Michigan Press. And it's a great book. It's a great book that kind of invites Africa and Africans to reappropriate their history, reappropriate their heritage, and think their economic and social futures through African frameworks rather than actually through frameworks that are imposed from elsewhere. So one reason why I translated that book into Arabic actually was that I wanted to have my Moroccan and my North African and Arab speaking fellows across the Arab world to have them engage with the thoughts of a sub-Saharan African writer and thinker, right? Because we often tend to build those kind of, to build or at least to maintain those borders and separations between areas and regions, right? Like when we say North Africa, as opposed to sub-Saharan Africa, right? So
Mm.
what I try to do with that work is to kind of to try to connect those spaces, bring them closer together, right? And I think we need more translation and we need more literary works that are able to circulate, right,
Yeah.
across regions. So, for instance, being able to read, I don't know, like a Congolese or an Ivorian author in Quebec, for instance, right, and being able to read a Senegalese author in Algiers or in Tunis or in Cairo, right? And so I think there is something that needs to be encouraged and strengthened and reinforced in terms of like, these dynamics of circulation. Because we were talking earlier about the 1960s, right? The post-independence period. Well, the post-independence period was very much interconnected, right? So if you take the Moroccan journal that you were referring to, Rafael, and on which I kind of spent a couple of years reading and analyzing, you find contributors, from Senegal, from Haiti, from Lebanon, so there was this kind of transnational space for reflection and solidarity. And I think it is is very important to kind
Mm.
of encourage us to think about all of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Khalid. And it's amazing to think that translation is just not one way thing, and it's also we started with about Francophone literature, and now we are talking about something which is maybe at the core of what
Mhm.
we could be experiencing in our writers,
Mhm.
academic or publishers, agents' lives. It's about how literature could escape hierarchies, how literature could find bridges to maybe reach other
Mhm.
readers, but also to have to reach a meaning that could be different from one place to the other through translation. I could mention an experience we have done, and that's also a link to what our friends at Catalyst are also achieving. You have published an Ugandan writer, Goretti Kemuhendo, last novel, Jessica. And Goretti, another work of Goretti, Whispers from Vera, was never translated ever into French. And this work will be published, translated into French in Côte d'Ivoire. So the very first translation into French of this very classic Ugandan novel will happen in Côte d'Ivoire. And for me, it also speaks volume about other dynamic, other perspectives that could carry works maybe to get another meaning, another sense of what translation and why translation is a powerful tool. And I'm very sensitive to what you said about translators should be acknowledged way more than what they are often, because without them, what we are saying right now will just be meaningless. We will just remain in these very isolated areas of language and never ever find bridges, find a way to access other places. And it's very engaging as a reflection, because maybe this is a way of jumping in what happened today around your work. And I was mentioning Ross Schwartz. So Ross Schwartz, which is for me a legendary translator, but she's also so engaged and committed professional and she got fond of your work, and she was, I think, catched by your last novel, which in French is titled Évocation d'un mémorial à Venise, but that will be published at Hop Road in the UK under Memorial in Venice as a title.
No, actually, it's a different side. Venice Requiem.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And I see, Raphaël, just to let you know that Alain is with us right now. So if you wanna, I think, if he, I think there is some issue with the video, but I'm sure he wants to contribute to the conversation.
Of course.
Yeah.
Alain, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I made a mistake. I thought it was 4 p.m. Like UK time, and I just figured out it's 3 p.m. UK time and 4 p.m. for France time. So sorry for being late.
No,
yeah, listening to you was like really interesting about translation. So I don't know. Yes, here I am.
Thank you so much. I'm just glad you're here, because we have so many crossed perspectives to talk about, and maybe I could just do a brief introduction of your work, Alain, and then we can jump back to what we were saying, and you could just catch up, because I think you have plenty of things to add and to nourish the conversation. So just Alain, just first thing I have to say that I first met you in London at London Book Fair.
Exactly.
with a couple of friends that are really into this literary activism from Bristol University, and they are working on translation, on setting up networks of translators, notably in Africa, in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Cameroon, to develop new trends. And we were mentioning Mongo Beti. Imagine that Mongo Beti will be probably published by a publisher in Cameroon linked to that network. So published by a very Cameroonian publisher for the first time ever, somehow. And this is just to say how important these networks are, and that you're very much connected in. So I was, when we started with discussing with Khalid, I introduced him as a multifaceted and intellectual, but you are also a very rich and with various background, and it's so interesting because it would be difficult for me to define exactly one single point. You're a researcher, you're an academic, you're an editor, you co-founded a publishing house, La Case des Lucioles, in Côte d'Ivoire about 2 years ago, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And you have also circulated in your work from Côte d'Ivoire to the UK to Canada and coming back to Côte d'Ivoire recently. And beside that, you have your writing work, especially as a poet.
Yeah.
You have published notably two works of poetry, Carrefour Samake and Corps sans organes, who received shortlist and literary prizes. And beside that, you have also worked in your research on Francophone African literature through notably this co-authored work, Routes et déroutes, les fictions francophones. So routes and detours in Francophone literature, if I have to put it in English, maybe.
Yep.
That is dealing with mobility and circulation in Francophone sub-Saharan fiction. So this is just to summarize who you are, but you have so many, many facets. And we were speaking about translation, and translation finds its meaning with publishing. And I would really like here to start with these publishing houses you have co-founded with some friends of yours, La Case des Lucioles, which was aiming somehow to shift also some aesthetics landscape in Côte d'Ivoire. Could you maybe let us know a little more about La Case des Lucioles?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a good summary. Most of the time, people are asking me, like, you're doing a lot of things. I don't know. I'm doing just one thing. I'm just working on literature, either I be a scholar, an editor, or a writer. I'm doing the same thing. So I don't have the feeling that I'm navigating through different type of literary scapes. So yeah, I'm just working on literature. That's the way it is. So talking about La Case des Lucioles, it was a way for me to work something out. You know, I've been writing poetry for a long time in Ivory Coast, and it was really hard for me to find, first of all, an editor, because people say that nobody read poetry in Ivory Coast or even in West Africa. So when I was in Canada, it was like really, really nice adventure, like a human adventure, a social adventure, a literary adventure. I learned a lot with poets in Canada. I'm talking about my editor, Kim Doré. She's wonderful. I think that's the best poet reader in the world for me. Like, she really knows how to push you like really far away and really think about the images you build while writing. And even like an elder, Rodney Saint-Éloi. So yeah, I learned a lot. And I just wanted to bring back this experience in Ivory Coast in order to defend poetry, but not only poetry. I've got a lot of friends, a lot of people I'm talking to all the time, who has a different way of seeing literature. So it's more audacious, more provocative, and that's the way I write. I don't like being common or conventional. So I've created this publishing house just to host all the way we can think differently Ivorian literature. And in my mind, I just wanted this publishing house to be famous like in 5 or 6 years after creating. 6 months, it was a success. We keep on receiving tons of like manuscripts like on a weekly basis. It's not easy at all because I don't know how to say it like in English, but on est l'une des rares maisons d'édition qui publie en droit d'éditeur en Côte d'Ivoire. And this is like something crazy to do, because like the market is more based on like school books. And so when you decide to do droit d'auteur, like publish a compte d'éditeur, like something really crazy and difficult to deal with. But besides it, we at La Case des Lucioles trying to create a real literary ecosystem. Like, for instance, we have like nous avons des rentrées littéraires, I say in English, like different type of literary seasons. We have 2. The first one is really linked to the Abidjan Book Fair, and the second one is really opening in December. And this thing changed. Like, we can say that we are game changer, and I think that some people here are. I can see Frédéric Saint-Julien. She can tell bits about La Case des Lucioles. So yeah, we are game changer in our like Ivorian field. And now we're trying to open ourselves to Cameroon and Senegal, because now we're starting to distribute like our novels and our books in Senegal and Cameroon, and we hope to go further and further. Yeah, that's the way. That's all I can tell about La Casa de Ciel for now.
Thank you so much. But what is also fascinating, you mentioned distribution, you mentioned Frédéric Saint-Julien, and hello, Frédéric. I haven't noticed that you were here, and I think it's very important to remember that publishing is an ecosystem. And when you enter an ecosystem, you also have to somehow deal with economics. And we were mentioning with Khalid that at some point, the economics of publishing have also influenced strongly genre and how literature developed somehow. So it's very interesting to, at some point, to notice the creation and the development of new ecosystems through activists like you are. And somehow my introduction to La Casa de Ciel was actually thanks to Frédéric. And when I went to the Abidjan Book Fair, the first thing I discovered about La Casa de Ciel wasn't about the books, it was about the songs. Because there was a group of singers, singers who were actually performing their own books on stage. And that's also how interesting and how innovative this is to shift from what is maybe a tradition, what could be seen as the so-called classic, that become at some point also some sort of burden, and for literary, not newcomers, but people who want to develop their own ways. It's important to create their own tools, and a publishing house is the best place for that. That's just what I want to mention, maybe. But if you want to add, of course, do so.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's nothing to have, nothing else to have. You're really right. This is really hard to be an African publisher. Like, this is really difficult, talking about mainly about economics and money. I mean, money is the real issue, because you're trying to defend some books, but like talking about Abidjan, like in Ivory Coast, for instance, there is not a really distribution network in Ivory Coast. So mainly when you publish a book, like we do, like, I don't know, a novel, a specific novel, like for instance, last year we published a post-dramatic piece of theater. Nobody would have in this country. Because we're trying to defend this kind of like narrative that should exist. But you are really restricted to Abidjan, the capital. And not only Abidjan, you are restricted to Cocody, which is like the bourgeois place, because the people will go to the library and we can afford like a certain amount of money to get these books. So now I think that the main challenge in Ivory Coast is to open the market to the whole country. And now that's what we're working on right now, trying to think about how to work with some sellers inside the country so that our book can circulate in the country. So when you enter this type of like, I can't say precarious, but it's a bit precarious, book markets, you have to be innovative. And that's why we're working with like spoken word artists. I'm myself a spoken word artist. I know it's a bit too much again, but yeah, so we trying to innovate all the time, trying to interrogate the market and ask what we can do to change things. Yeah. So you were right.
Yeah, and I also have to salute and pay my respect to Stephanie Kitchen, who just put a comment in the comment section. Stephanie is so sorry, Stephanie, but I have to introduce you. You're the director of the African Books Collective, which is distributing, especially in the north, about 200 publishing houses from the African continent across the world. So, and it's very interesting that the African Books Collective was created in the late 80s from a very very fascinating idea. There was this prejudice of book famine in Africa at the time, which was linked to many famine schemes through music, basically also. And so there was a single picture of Africa provided in the world, and which was very ambiguous and really shading all the diversity of cultural, historic, and languages and everything. And the African Books Collective started from one single idea, which was, in my opinion, very essential, fundamental. It was to deal with the famine of African books in the North, because there were African publishers, of course, everywhere, historically developed, but not accessible in the North. And then we enter this very challenging aspect of networks and connections. And we were talking with Khalid before you arrived, Alain, Serge. We were talking about translator, and such as translator, publishers and distributors are so essential to our ecosystem, not only on the practical way, but also on the intellectual perspective, which is very essential. I guess you have an invitation to connect with the African Books Collective here.
Yeah, I just read it, and I just want to say thank you. And yes, I will. I will. Yes, of course, I will. You're right about translation. As a scholar and as a writer who left Canada to come back to Ivory Coast, even if I think Europe and North America are always calling me back, because after 2 years in Canada, I've been appointed to Bristol, where I met my friend Khalid. We had a really great time drinking high peas in Bristol and with colleagues and so on. Khalid is drinking water, of course. Yeah, I have to mention it. But yeah, I think translation is really vital for our literary and intellectual landscape. Because for me, for a long time, I've been quoting researchers from Europe and North America, because I know there's no way for me to meet people, to meet scholars, and to make faults, intellectual fault from Senegal, Ghana, and so on, because there's no circulation of ideas. And it's even worse with literature. For instance, the only writers that I know from Nigeria are those who are famous in USA. I'm not even able to tell you a name of a Nigerian writer who is local to Nigeria. The same thing with Senegal. I only know the most writers that I know and I'm reading a lot are those who are made famous in France, like Boris Diop, my friend Bogarsa, and so on. So I think that the real translation issues right now is to be able to connect local literary scapes without being indebted or linked to Paris or Montreal or New York and so on. And I think that that's the main issue. We have to build really translation institution locally that could link, kind of build a new region of literature, which does not depend on Europe and so on. I'm not spiting on Europe, of course. This is really important to have this connection. I've been to London Book Fair where I had a chance to meet you. I was drowned. Really, you realize that the first time as an editor, I was feeling so small, both as a small publisher and as an African as well, because you exist nowhere, nowhere at all. And I'm really I can say kudos to you for advocating for Francophone African, but you were the only one, in a small place all by yourselves. This is not easy at all. So yes, I think there is something to do, and this thing must be done locally between countries and small publishers.
Yeah. Can I add something to that, Raphaël?
Sure, please.
Yeah, no, I just want to emphasize, I think, two ideas that Alain has shared earlier. I think the first one, Alain, when you said that you do the same thing, you do just literature across the board and in different forms. And I think, I came to realize recently that is the only way to do and promote African literature, right? So you have to be present, right, across the board. So you have to be able, right, to operate, as a scholar, as a writer, as a facilitator, as somebody who is just using, I guess, the tools that are available to
Hmm.
make African literature visible and to
Yeah.
make it, receivable by the audience. And I think we are, to be honest, I think we are increasingly moving toward this kind of praxis, right? This ability to combine different forms of engagements and different forms of work that happens actually in different through different mediums, right?
Hmm.
Because when we met in Bristol, we were talking about African literature, and it was a very different, environments, right? Because we
Yeah.
were in a scholarly environment that has its own kind of, frameworks
Hmm.
and language, and and it is very enriching. And I think one of the benefits here is that we are able and we should be able to actually, learn lessons from one area and one environment, and then kind of, bring it in to other environments, right? Like, let's
Yeah.
say, like, what are the conversations that are happening in African scholarship, right? So that would help us to see what could work in terms of publishing, what could work in
Hmm.
terms of translation, where to shift the focus, right? And I think there is really something. I think we need more people who are able to move from one discipline to another, from one area to another. I think that is very, very crucial. And the other thing I want to say, Alain, is that I really encourage you, and if there's anything I can do to help, to make the books of La Case de Luciole available in Morocco.
Great.
And I think, to kind of make that connection as well, what I was talking about earlier in terms of, like, bridging the gap as well
Hmm.
between North Africa and
Yeah.
Sub-Saharan Africa. I know it's
Yeah.
very challenges, but I think if, as you rightly said, I think it's a matter of people who at some point take it on themselves to do it, right? And
Hmm.
then they just work, through all the challenges.
Yeah. Just to say something quick. Thank you. Thank you a lot, Bradley. Thank you a lot. Now I'm friends with Yacine from California Live.
Hmm.
Yeah, so we're working on how to make
Excellent.
books available in Morocco and like books from Morocco available in Ivory Coast. So yeah, that's a project we're working on. But you are really invited to join us with
Yeah.
Frédéric Saint-Julien. This is like our like small dream team to try to
Sure.
change. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So
But
that's really the idea. I think we should connect without being able to transit through Europe or North America before getting to know each other. And that's for me, that's the main issue, like for our ministries to build this kind of, if they don't want to build this thing, we gotta be the first one to do it, and maybe they will follow us because
Sure.
when once you in the field of publishing, you realize that it's we got the ideas, but besides ideas, it's a lot of money.
Mm. Yes, yes, and thank you, Alain, for pointing to the political dimension of all of this conversation, because it has to do with political,
Yeah.
decision, and also with political structures. Because we hear a lot of, there's like an ongoing discourse about like Africa and African unity and all of that. But I think it's time to make, those discourses applicable and like concrete, make them concrete in the publishing world, for instance, or in literary production. So I think we need more efforts in that direction, and I
Yes.
think you are already doing it with La Case de Luciole. Yeah.
uh,
Humbly. Much more
is
to do. Much more.
isn't it beautiful to imagine that you're discussing about collaborating, distributing, and promoting works from Morocco to Côte d'Ivoire and the other way around from a platform that is provided so far by a project in South Africa. I mean, this is the meaning of what we are dealing here. We talk about starting point is Francophone literature. But then we talk about this world connection that makes the literature not isolated and linked to other environments, to nourish, to influence, to develop together. That's what happened around Présence africaine in the 50s. That's what happened around so many movements. And when things started from one single place, I think about Ibadan in Nigeria, where so many things developed from the late 50s. And at some point, it's just a matter of some crazy people that could be seen as activists that will just engage on something that could be seen as an utopia. But this utopia could create things like the African Books Collective, like La Casa des Lucioles, like Présence Africaine. And that's also a way of highlighting that your work, both your works, are also finding place, finding space, because you have publishers that are able to see broader. Présence Africaine is able to welcome your work, Khalid, like your last novel, Évocation d'un mémorial à Venise, is a so innovative work. I can imagine that many publishers wouldn't have engaged on such novel, not because it's not of high quality. I'm the first to advocate your work, but because it's a courageous stand. It's a very specific, original, and we need publishers that are able to embrace such works. And Alain, Serge, I can think about your last work that is first part of a trilogy, Farewell to Kourouma, L'adieu à Kourouma, though published by La Casa de Lucioles, am I correct? Huh?
Yeah.
That is also the first, volume of a trilogy built around violence, memory, from a tragedy that actually happened in Abidjan around
Yeah.
a massacre in a hotel. But it's also an aesthetic stand of yours. And that to highlight that your project will just somehow develop and flourish because you are able to catch up with publishers that have this sensibility. And that's so how precious this is.
Yeah, it's very precious. Maybe Raid should start because you talk about like Raid first, and I could maybe add something.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, no, thank you, Rafa. I mean, very briefly on that, I think, yes, it means a lot to me to be published by like a publishing house like Présence Africaine, who has like this kind of, history of engagement with Pan-Africanism, the publications of, the work of Aimé Césaire and others. I think it means a lot to me to be like to put myself in the footsteps of these authors who have inspired my writing, who have inspired my classes, my teaching. So, and also it is very meaningful in the sense that we tend to forget, like a publisher like Présence Africaine has published so many North African writers, actually both the publishing house and the journal as well, because just as a reminder, so it's both a journal and a publishing house and a bookstore. So if you ever make it to Paris, you have to visit the bookstore, right? And so for me, writing this book, this novel, which is also like, I mean, I don't know if I can, if I still call it like a novel, but it's a novel, but at the same time, it's a novel that kind of combines different literary genres, different literary forms. It's a novel that questions literature, basically. So the story is about, the tragic story of a Gambian refugee who drowned actually in Venice in 2017. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is both to reconstruct, what happened during that day, and at the same time, I'm opening up. I'm opening both myself up and I'm opening my writing up to Gambia. I'm writing as a Moroccan, right, who knew nothing or who knew very little about Gambia as a country, about Gambian culture, and I'm trying to write I wrote that book as form of, I guess, a letter or as an invitation to connect North Africa, the northern parts of the continent, with the southern part, right? So what does it mean for a Moroccan writer like myself to write a novel about a Gambian refugee and about the question of migration, right? Well, it means first of all, bringing in all these kind of common histories that we have, right, and trying to reinvent a new, or at least like create a literary form, right, that can accommodate all these histories, and that can make us think about what connects us, what makes us you know, close to each other, and what do we have in common in terms of like histories, in terms of futures, etc., etc. So that is what I really try to do in that book. And I think someone like Aimé Césaire has been central and has been crucial to my writing, because with Césaire I got like that, energy, that poetic energy, combined with a sense of political agency and a political empowerment as well, right? So I had to recount that story, and to narrate, and to try to kind of put things together. But while doing that, I was also trying to question literature, and to question, I guess, to interrogate what literature can do, and what are the limitations of writing. So it's kind of this kind of reflective approach to literature that I am very much interested in, and I'm trying, I'm inviting the reader to kind of embark on that investigation, and at the same time to think with me about literature, and about words, and about language. And you mentioned earlier Ross Schwartz translation. I'm really, really excited that the novel is coming out in English translation in February in the UK. And to me, seeing that book in English is also such an opportunity, right? To be in conversation with other audiences as well. And I'm also hoping that the book will at some point make it to Gambia, right, where you have like English speaking, readership that hasn't perhaps engaged with the novel so far. So I'm really excited about that as well.
Thank you, Khalid. And also just mentioning that you notably opened your beautiful and powerful novel with a quote from Aimé Césaire's "And the dog were silent." Just one sentence. "There also in the green water of lagoons, even drowned, I will never be that colored to think about you. I left all my words at the pound shop."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just to say that works like yours are always an invitation to go further. I think works that are relevant are the works that are they stand for themselves, but they also open up to a broader space, which is, for example, all this Césaire's universe. And this is also, for me, a way of linking with Alain's last work and this farewell to Kourouma. Of course, the first thing that would sparkle my interest is this Kourouma place in the title. And then you have other characters in that book, notably one guy who is a psychogeographer. His name is Franz.
Yes.
So maybe he's a little bit linked to what we are saying about postcolonial. I don't know, but I would love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, Franz, the character Franz, which is like the main character, even if like it's only appearing between chapters. This is Franz Fanon, like really, because his name is Franz F. So this is Franz Fanon is sick, and before dying, is trying to create a new map of Abidjan, because he thinks that this map is so colonial, and yeah, he's trying to build networks. So it's kind of a tribute to Franz Fanon, tribute to like French situationism, all this guy Guy Debord, like I mean, all the thinkers that used to challenge my way of thinking life in general. So yeah, and Kourouma here, I mean, most of readers when they go and like in Ivory Coast, when they go buy the book, it's like, oh yeah, this is something like more about Kourouma, but Kourouma only appears on like the characters in the last chapter.
Mhm.
So the link to Kourouma here is more, I don't say if I can say ontologically, but this is more about a reflection on how to testify of a trauma. Like for instance, for me, I've been reading a lot of book about Ivory Coast civil war, like for decades, and I was so shocked and surprised of how logic was this testimony, because I know, I mean, you've been to Ivory Coast, Raphael. I don't know if you've been to Maki, because we didn't have the time to really catch up in Abidjan. We got so busy during like Abidjan Book Fair. But when you come back, we go to Maki. Maybe you have the chance. And if you go to Maki, you realize that there's always a time, like always a time, when we talk about civil war. Like this discussion will pop up. Like, I mean, Frederic can like testify, and this is always so unstructured. There's no logic at all. Like we could talk about like the time we realized that a soldier was invincible because he did some like mystical stuff, and then we go back to Laurent Gbagbo, then we go back to some. There's no logic at all. So I just really want my book to think about the structure, not only copy the structure, this way of like thinking of African testify of this the strategy, but really to interrogate and question this way of like of telling a story, our story at all. And for me, there was a trauma that I've been carrying for a long time, both historical and individual. It's the massacre of like young Ivorians by French army at Oteliwa. And there is something so wonderful with my country, and maybe like most of like African countries, we really don't deal with memory the way people do in Europe. Like we don't care about memory at all. We have our own way to deal with memory. We can talk about like Kamel Naouris, what happened because he came back to unbury this like memory about Algerian civil war. Like it's the same thing with us, and nobody is talking about this massacre. No one is talking about it. We can talk about it in Maki, but not on a historical and like academic point of view. There's nothing really written about it. The only documentaries about this massacre have been made by like French leftist journalists. That is to tell that there is something. So I really want to write something about it, but not really about the massacre on the like. I mean, the first, the premier tome, like the first part of the trilogy, is really how to survive after this massacre. So there you will have like three characters talking about how they see this massacre after it happened, like maybe a decade after. And the second part of the trilogy that I'm writing right now will be like more, I don't say more aggressive, because this is like more, now I'm going to really into it. Because I think the first one was kind of an introduction to it. So the second one will be really more about it. So Nigeria Kourouma is more about how you should like destructure the plot of a classic novel as Kourouma for me was. So there's not a really linear logic. It's really three people who just talking a lot about how they live this experience. And I'm really happy because a lot of people have been like writing about this novel in Ivory Coast a lot, and they all say when you read each chapter for itself, it's so easy to read, but put together it's so complicated, and that's really what I wanted it to be. But I think that for the next part will be like more readable. Yes, that's what I can say. And maybe if I could add one more thing is that. And that's when you realize that we forget for the word, we really fucked up as African publisher or African writer, because there's always a part of regret saying that maybe I should have published my book first, as I did for my poetry in Europe or Canada before doing it in Ivory Coast, because you don't have here the infrastructures to make the book alive for a long time, if you know what I mean. And this is really complicated. Yep.
But that's a long-standing topic, the choice of the publisher. But what is quite interesting is that now I can observe is like writers are navigating more and more, especially in the Francophone sphere, across different areas for their writings. And there are so many possibilities in terms of publishing collaborations and in contractual practice as well. But it's for our friends from South Africa, it could be kind of silly to say let's say like that, because this is a very normal thing in the Anglo-Saxon world, basically. But in the Francophone, we started our discussion, Alain, Khalid and me, about centralism. And it's also a way for me to loop the discussion somehow, that it's difficult to escape that centralism. And that's when this activism of writers, intellectual, and publishers, especially, and translators happens. I think about all these workshops of translation that were organized in West Africa through the Bristol team a few years ago. It's kind of groundbreaking. This is opening new spaces. This is how a writer from Uganda could be translated in French for the first time in French in Côte d'Ivoire. And it's also having this choice and maybe this making this stand of choosing to start there and not there. I remember Sarah Ladipo Manika, this tremendous writer from Nigeria. She once was asked, why are you publishing at Cassava Republic Press in Abuja? And basically, her first novel was sold about 3 million copies at Cassava Republic. Okay. And she always answered something like, an African publishers can be better or even worse than a Western publisher. He can do things bad or better. I don't put it the right way, but the idea is that at some point we can also overcome all these prejudices of publishing infrastructures. And this is helping literature. When you talk about your work, what I hear is that you can address things that could not be possible the same way if published in France or if maybe published in Canada. When you mention this Maquis conversation, that's something you're trying also to put and to insert in your aesthetics. And that's quite interesting how literature published by a certain publisher in Côte d'Ivoire could access a new space for aesthetics. And Khalid, I can also link it, saying and writing the unspeakable. Your novel, Évocation d'un mémorial à Venise, starts from something which was just a tragedy on screen, a guy drowned in the Grand Canal. And he had no name. He was just a migrant, not a human being, a migrant. Nobody helped that guy. And then you develop the space and you create something which is some sort of recreating a humanity to that man who had a history to share, who had a background, who was also himself a bridge from Gambia to Italy, and also bridging the global south and the Western world, maybe. And this is, I don't want to be too long, and we can develop this conversation for years, of course, but this is how interesting and important your works are, because your publishing choices, your aesthetic choices are allowing us to open up the space that is so larger than just Francophone literature not published in France or something like that.
Yeah, and thank you, Raphael. Yeah, I just want to kind of follow up on something that Alain said earlier that I think that I just want to highlight. I think there is a question around, cultural and literary memory in Africa, in the African continent. I think that there needs to be more efforts in terms of thinking about how writers, how intellectuals, how artists are being remembered, or conversely, how they are being completely forgotten and overlooked. And I think there needs to be some change on that level, right? We need to take the question of cultural memory seriously, right? Because I think it won't come just from kind of individual initiatives, but it has to be also a political decision in terms of supporting cultural structures that address the question of memory. Think about when you want to write, let's say, the biography of an African author, you will struggle just to kind of piece things together and like come up with the narrative or like engage with sources. Sometimes you would kind of just kind of struggle with access to archives and things like that. So I think we need to continue, right, promoting this sense of like cultural memory and emphasize. And I just wanted to kind of emphasize that. And just a footnote to the example, since Alain mentioned, Kamel Daoud, I just want to say this. It is very fascinating sometimes in the West and including in France, right? When we see like some authors, being in the spotlights, right? And when they win like literary prizes, let's say in France, they become like almost they are made into like symbols or like, they become like entry points to topics. So what happened, for instance, with Kamel Daoud's most recent novel is that we started reading at some point, articles saying, "Oh, this is the novel about La Décennie Noire, about the Black Decade, the Algerian civil war. This is the novel." Well, actually, it's not true because if you go back and you read, in the 90s, in the 2000s, there have been other Algerian authors like Meissa Bey, like Malika Mukhaddam, for instance, like you have to read other, kind of expand and you look deeper into Algerian literature, you realize that there are other writers that needs to be taken into consideration. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's also important to keep like always, and this is what I'm hearing from Alain as well, is this kind of keeping this critical perspective,
Mm.
on the field, right? So being like very, I guess, careful when handling literary works and when dealing with the reception, right? Because we have to invent our own reception as well, right? And we have to provide like the tools to make your books available. And this has to do with another issue actually, which is the question of like literary criticism, right? So I personally publish a lot of book reviews. This is something that I enjoy doing, reviewing books. And I realize again that there is perhaps there aren't that many opportunities as well in Africa and in the African continent to publish like reviews, let's say in literary magazines or in cultural magazines. So I think there needs to be also like a work that has to be done on that front, having some sort of platforms, right, where you can share. I mean, there are a couple, right? There are a couple, but
Mm.
what I'm saying is that we need to kind of emphasize and we need to go deeper. We need to have those sort of platforms like, digital magazines where we can also kind of, promote and reflect and think and make African literature readable and accessible. And I think that that is very important because it has to do with the life of a book, right? When a book is published, you know, there is like the book enters this kind of journey, and across along that journey, the book needs support, right? It
Mhm.
needs support. It needs to be visible, and one way of doing that is by writing on that book, by making thinking, bringing more readers to share their experience and all of that. And I think that is also like crucial element as well.
Thank you. Um, Alain, if you maybe have something to add, then there is a question, and I think we can maybe welcome a couple of other questions, and then maybe we don't have to exceed too much time for the conversation. But it's so rich, and it's an invitation to continue more than just a roundtable. But you're mentioning project basically, Khalid, to develop project and collaboration, and to think about journals and the access to media and how to share literature and thinking through different platforms that are maybe existing but not enough or not existing between some
Mhm.
spaces. But
Yeah, just to kind of answer briefly the question. I think Shuangli Li's question is very interesting on and hi, by the way, another Bristol connection. um, uh, yeah, the question of the readership is very important, I guess, right? Hi. Um, well, I think when I don't know about Alain's experience, but I don't think like in a very explicit way about the readership when I write, right? Because when you write, when I personally write, I'm in a process of, shaping that literary work, according to a structure, as Alain was explaining earlier. And I think it's a very, it's a very focused process. It's between me and what I'm writing or what I'm trying to write. And I think as I write, I start becoming more and more aware, right? Increasingly aware of the readership. And this is where you
Exactly.
kind of start, you start bringing in the reader. So I really, really absolutely like what Alain said earlier about like, I don't want to make the work, like easy, in the sense that like, oh, this is just consumption, This is, I'm just gonna tell you a story with the start point and end point, and that's it. That's not. I personally, that's not also that, like Alain. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in bringing the reader on a journey and making the journey challenging as well, informative but also challenging. And I think
Yeah.
I'm very moved by like all this literature that always tries to unsettle the reader in a way, somehow it's like to make the reader uncomfortable. So it can be challenging, it can be work on structure, work on language, work on form. So in the case of my second novel, it has to do with the fragments. Basically, I wrote this novel in fragments because I mean, the starting point was that this tragedy, there is no single form, no cohesive structure that could explain what happened, right? So I had to write in fragments in order to allow the reader to think from one, to kind of connect one idea with the other, one hypothesis with the other, also to allow some space for the reader to reflect on the writing, on the reading experience, and that's what matters to me. Yeah. And
Yeah,
obviously,
maybe just
yeah, later, like there are a readership can like reinvent the novel's meaning. Yeah. Sorry, Alan, go ahead.
yeah, just like maybe like one small thing. I totally agree with Ali. Like maybe we should write an essay together about being a writer facing readership. I think that being a poet first before being a novelist was so like uh, enriching because when you write poetry, it's totally different than writing a novel because you really know because you're going to deal with a specific type of readership, really uh, really keen to be like a dépaysé. I don't know how to say in English, like unscaped,
Mhm.
because like uh, poetry is really about being dépaysé. Like when you enter poetry, you know that language will be different. You know that you would like to struggle, and you're not really looking for like sense or meaning, for like, but you're looking for like a different type of experience. You know what I mean? So I can say that I just transposed my way of thinking poetry to literature. And the first version, like the four first version of La Kourouma, all of my readers like Sami Chak and so they were like, okay. Because I mean in our team, like small like writer team, we always say that if Sami Chak loves your book, write it again. It's not good. This would be so complicated to read. And Savage Jack loved all the version. I'm like, no, this not. I don't think this book will be readable. So when uh, people in Ivory Coast read the book, they're like, okay, we know you're a good writer. We love the stories, but we need something more readable. And then, because as a writer, I want to write something for people around me. And then you really start to struggle between to find or to navigate and find like a kind of like a balance between what I want to write, what I want to be, and as one of my favorite writers says, uh, create something that people could buy. So you know what I mean, because you have to assume the fact that this is a market and we part of the market. So I mean, for me right now, for like the second part of the trilogy, the Abidjan trilogy, this is really what I'm trying to do, being Agnessan, being Alain, Serge, and being like a seller, you know what I mean? And that's very interesting. That's really, I don't know, thing like exciting, yes, to deal with. Like,
Thank you
for
so
instance, Michel
much.
Tournier says in his essay, he says like, I'm a writer, but I know that I'm also a seller. So I want my reader to buy a really good thing to read. You know what I mean? That's the way it is.
Thank you so much. I think we can use that as an ending point because it's so important. And Francophone literature is not something specific, but thinkers, writers wanting to share their works and in as many readership and languages as possible. So I think if Jessica, you agree on that, we can maybe end this conversation for now, but we will share resources, links towards our friends' work. And I'm so grateful, Alain, Khalid, really your magics. I mean, I'm grateful to know you guys, and I measure how lucky we are to be able to discuss on so important topics and to think, create, and collaborate. And this is thanks to Catalyst and Reading Africa Weeks and really, I'm grateful, really. That's what I want to say.
I am also grateful. This was an astonishing conversation, so thoughtful, and I learned so much. And I know everybody did. We were one of my staff members and I were discussing privately how good we were, how good this conversation was, and how thrilled we were with it. So thank you so, so much. Anybody that wants to quote from this, please include Reading Africa, the hashtag Reading Africa. We will be putting this up later on YouTube, and so it will be available for the world shortly after we complete this. So thank you so much. Thank you, Raphael. You did a tremendous job moderating. Thank you, Alain and
Thank
Khalid,
you.
for
Thank
joining
you.
us. We really appreciate your wealth of knowledge and experience and insights. Thank you so much.
So, bye bye.
Thank you.